Welcome to the IISS for our important discussion session this morning on democratization in Afghanistan. My name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I'm the Senior Fellow for South Asia and the head of the South Asia program at the Institute. Afghanistan remains in a stalemated war more than 17 years after the United States-led intervention in the country. Recently, the US announced that it had made progress towards a draft framework for peace with the Taliban. 2 days ago, the US Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, met Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, one of the co-founders of the Taliban, as part of the negotiations between the US government and the Afghan Taliban. However, as Afghanistan prepares for presidential elections scheduled for July 2019, anxieties remain within the country and parts of the region over the possibility of a Taliban role in any interim or future Afghan government. In view of the complexities of and the multiple stakeholders involved in the long-running conflict, inclusivity appears to be key to any prospective solution for Afghanistan. To this effect, how has democracy benefited Afghanistan in the past 17 years? What support have Afghanistan's allies and partners pledged to this cause? And how does India view its role in the future of Afghanistan? To discuss these issues, I am delighted to welcome our speaker this morning. Ambassador Gotha Mukhopadhyay served as India's ambassador to Afghanistan from 2010 to 2013. In November 2001, he had reopened the Indian embassy in Kabul and served as charge d'affaires at the embassy until March 2002, where he re-established India's diplomatic relations with the newly formed government in Afghanistan. He also served as India's ambassador to Myanmar from 2013 to 2016 and as ambassador of India to Syria from 2006 to 2009. Ambassador Mukhopadhyay will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by a discussion session. Ambassador.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. It's a privilege to speak at the IISS London before such an informed and distinguished audience on how India views 17 years of international involvement and the current situation in Afghanistan. A very warm word of thanks to Rahul Roy Chaudhary for the invitation and for chairing this session. Before I proceed, I must clarify that I'll be speaking today in my individual personal capacity, and as I have no role in the government of India anymore, but I sincerely hope that my words will have a little more value than just that. The subject of today's talk, as framed by Rahul just now, is democratization in Afghanistan. But the subtext is really the threat posed to it by the peace talks that are currently underway. And presumably this is also the reason why you are here. So let me just tackle that question head on right at the outset. Let me also alert you that my assessment of this process is unrelentingly pessimistic. So forgive me if I am a little pessimistic, if a little one-sided in my remarks this morning. Now, from the point of view of the US and the West, the case for peace talks with the Taliban, divorced from the mistakes, flaws, costs, and difficulties, sounds compelling. The current narrative goes something like this. After 70 years of a US-led war against terrorism in Afghanistan, a troop surge in 2010, a new muscular strategy announced by President Trump in August 2017 on the one hand, and the enormous cost in Afghan, US, and other lives and treasure on the other, the war has reached a stalemate with an estimated 50% of Afghan territory under the control of the Taliban, and cannot go on indefinitely. There is no military solution to the Taliban on the battlefield. Peace talks, therefore, are an imperative. On the Afghan side, despite the huge investment of the international community in governance, security, human rights, and development in Afghanistan, it is felt that the Afghans too have not quite stepped up to the plate. Security-wise, despite impressive achievements in countering dramatic terrorist attacks and takeover of provincial cities like Kunduz and Ghazni, amongst others, it is believed that without operational US support, the Afghan security forces will not be able to stem the Taliban tide. Politically, while presidential and parliamentary elections have been held, their results have been severely contested and required US intervention at times, and governance as a whole remains a mess. Though the 2004 constitution was an achievement, the seeds of the present political crisis is said to lie in the exclusion of the Taliban from its drafting, and is therefore arguably not adequately representative of the Afghan people. What act of statesmanship it would have required to do this in the aftermath of Ahmad Shah Massoud's assassination, 9/11, when the Taliban were a defeated force and recognized by only 3 countries internationally, and with Osama bin Laden still at large, is unexplained and is surely a kind of revisionist hindsight view. In any case, the prevailing warlordism, ethnicity, and tribalism are seen as not compatible with democracy. So goes the narrative. And while laudable and desirable, democratization and human rights, including women's rights, are not the reasons why the US is in Afghanistan. They are there to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And if that can be secured, it is really for the Afghans to figure out a social and political system suitable for themselves. As firm a Democrat as President Obama more or less acknowledged this once. The implicit link between the political system that harbors extremism and terrorism and one that fights it, which was the reason for democracy and nation building light in Afghanistan in the first place, is conveniently forgotten. Also implicit is another assumption that somehow the Taliban, with their demand for an Islamic emirate, represent an authentic Afghan voice, and that democracy, as the West knows it, is not suitable for the Afghans. According to this narrative, therefore, there is no alternative to a negotiated peace in which the West basically negotiates its own security interests and the Afghans negotiate their political system. Now, though superficially seductive, this narrative is flawed on several counts: logical, political, and security, and far from bringing peace and stability, could have profound security and other implications for Afghanistan, the region, and beyond. So let us interrogate these elements one by one. First, the logic of the current peace process. There is no question that after nearly 40 years of foreign intervention, internal conflict, and externally supported terrorism, the Afghan people want peace, not least the Afghan government that has gone out of its way to court it. The issue is not peace, but what kind of peace. The Afghan people do not only want peace against war, but also an end to terrorism. This is critical. It is one thing to argue that a peace process is necessary, and quite another to claim that what is being presented now is the answer. There are several reasons to feel that the present processes, far from bringing peace to the region, will more likely only lead to another chapter in the Afghan quagmire and make things worse. First, they are not really led by the Afghan people, but by outside powers driven by their own interests. The US compulsion is essentially to get out of its military commitment to Afghanistan, and let the Afghans fight out their battles themselves. I leave you to guess what the Russian motivations are, but briefly, it is essentially to make the most of the US discomfiture in Afghanistan. I will leave aside the motivations of others, Pakistan, Iran, China, for the moment. Maybe we could come to it at the Q&A. But both Russia and the US are united on one point. They do not care what happens in Afghanistan, provided extremism and terrorism do not spill over into their homelands or spheres of influence. That's the basic deal that is being part of the framework. This is apparent in the outline of the framework revealed so far, where the basic understandings hinges around a US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan in return for guarantees that Afghanistan will no longer be a safe haven for terrorists who can strike the US. This is a Faustian bargain. Under this, Afghanistan will have to live with terror for the US. The Afghans, of course, are extremely conscious of this. They feel very strongly that they are on the front line of the battle against terrorism, that they are taking the maximum casualties, and that they are not only fighting a battle for themselves, but for the region and beyond. The US entered Afghanistan in 2001 to fight a war against terror. Even the Americans cannot be oblivious of what that means to that war. Granted, this is only one element of that framework, and other elements such as a ceasefire, talks with the Afghan government, a possible delay in the July presidential elections, and an interim government are still to be addressed. But having achieved international recognition through the US and Russian-led peace talks, and sensing blood, the Taliban are in no mood to compromise, or at least have no incentive to compromise. And one cannot escape the feeling that the concessions being offered, including on women's rights at the last Moscow talks, are just a smokescreen to grab power as soon as they can. Second, again, no question that the Afghan people want peace, but they want peace on their terms and at their pace, not a pace dictated by timelines predicated on a US withdrawal. At the very least, they wish to preserve the gains of the last 17 years. This was made clear even by those who participated in the Moscow meeting. Third, there are two parallel processes at work. The US process that aims to bring in the Afghan government at some stage, eventually, and the Moscow process that is willing to bypass the Afghan government and rely on other political parties and forces pursuing their own political interests. The Afghan government has been willing to negotiate this with the Taliban since the London conference. With the US behind the Afghan government, there was a balance at the negotiating table. By striking its own path, offering to draw back military support, and acting as a facilitator, the balance has been tilted in favor of Taliban. The same is true for the Moscow talks. The Afghan representatives at the Moscow conference may represent key political forces, but they cannot claim to represent the will of the Afghan people. The intra-Afghan dialogue and the public legitimization of the Taliban by the US, Russia, Pakistan, and others will thus reduce the elected government in Kabul to just one of the participants, a quite unacceptable interference in the international communities of the international community in Afghanistan's constitutional order. Similarly, talk of an interim government in place of presidential elections will essentially take Afghanistan back to square one, the Bonn process. The only difference being that instead of allied groups who captured power in Kabul then, with the help of the US, Pakistan and its proxies, along with an assortment of others, variously vetted by the US and Russia, will forge such a coalition. Such a government cannot be representative. Of course, there is an attempt to harmonize the two processes, but at this point one can only hope that the Afghan government and the constituency that it represents is not left high and dry at the insistence of the Taliban. This cannot be taken for granted. Fourth, and this is particularly important, the two processes together, one talking directly to the Taliban and the second bringing political forces at a tangent to the Afghan government at the expense of the latter, run the risk of undermining the entire structure on which the post-Bonn agreement in Afghanistan, in which we have all invested, has been built. If the Afghan government were to be delegitimized and marginalized, all the institutions based on this structure too would erode. This could open a dangerous political and security vacuum similar to the 1990s. I'm not arguing here for the popularity of the present government or even its political base. This can only be proven in elections that are due in a few months and for which candidates have already announced their intentions. But whatever may be the shortcomings of the post-Bonn dispensation, the 2004 Afghan constitution and the numerous attempts to negotiate a peace and reconciliation process so far, one point is notable. The post-Bonn consensus on Afghanistan has held, that is until now. Despite political frictions and ethnic rivalries, to date no Afghan political figure has questioned the fundamentals of the Afghan constitution, and no Afghan politician has crossed over to the Taliban. On the contrary, at least one belligerent, Hizb-e-Islami Hikmatyar, has rejoined the political arena. In a country as fractious as Afghanistan, that itself is something. One of the sad outcomes of this peace process, frankly, I'm not convinced it's a peace process, it's rather a disengagement process, is that that consensus is now at stake. There is one thing that I've always told my Afghan friends. They cannot do anything about the international community, who will take their decisions based on their interests and their costs. And this will change from time to time. This is only natural. They cannot also count on a change of heart by Pakistan or the Taliban. These decisions are out of their hands. The only thing in their own hands is their own unity. United, they have braved foreign interventions and the Taliban, and they can face up to other threats if necessary. Divided, they play into others' hands. Through the current peace process, the international community has prepared the conditions to divide Afghanistan once again, to the benefit of Pakistan. But a divided country cannot deliver peace. Fifth, the unraveling of the post-Bond constitutional order and the political consensus that underpins it would also have grave implications for the security of the region. Not only would it create conditions for others to take sides and interfere and intervene even more deeply in Afghanistan's affairs, but political instability and terrorism would spill well beyond Afghanistan. We are already seeing one version of this in what is happening in the Pulwama attack in Jammu and Kashmir and its repercussions. This is a replay of the period after the Soviet withdrawal when Pak-sponsored terrorists turned their attention to J&K. It will not be limited to that and cannot easily be contained in the region by the kind of guarantees from the Taliban that the US seems satisfied with. One of the assumptions beneath such an understanding is that the security concerns and political system can be clinically separated. It is being forgotten that the Western contribution to democracy in Afghanistan was not merely to bring political rights to a deprived nation. Rather, it was believed that democracy, or more widely an open society, underpinned by democratic values and politically and economically integrated to the international community, as the US did with Japan and Germany and the Europe and East Asia, more generally with the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, was the best guarantee that Afghanistan would not once again become an extremist or failed state where extremist forces could harbor like-minded outfits. This is what happened during Taliban rule in Afghanistan. This link is now being ignored. It's another matter that in the flips and flops of US and Western decision-making from President Bush to President Trump, including the decision taken at the London conference in 2010 to talk to the Taliban, this commitment was not taken. This commitment to democracy and political security that came with democracy was not taken to its logical conclusion. Regrettably, the UK has done more than any other country to legitimize the Taliban in this sense. The Taliban can offer guarantees on international terrorism on the negotiating table today. But can they abandon the innate sympathy for extremist Islamist forces that threaten the region and the world, that brought Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan in the first place? Of all the Islamic causes that fire political Islam, the Palestinian issue and hostility towards the US remain at the top. In the jihadist agenda, victory in Khorasan is the passport to the Holy Lands. Can we be sure that the jihadi victory in Afghanistan will be confined to Khorasan? Will this dilute jihadi fervor against the West or vindicate it? Sixth, along with undermining the Constitution and the constitutional institutions and the security of the region, the current peace talks also run the risk of sacrificing all the gains that Afghanistan has made since 2001 and wasting the huge investments that the West and others have made in it, not least in democracy and human rights, including the advancement of women in Afghanistan. It is fashionable, and I would say facile today, to disparage these achievements and characterize the post-Afghanistan project as a failure. But these are real, and even if incomplete. I need hardly labor these games before such an informed audience, and they have been persuasively presented by Afghan government authorities, most recently by National Security Advisor Mohib at the Munich Security Conference, and recorded in several other commentaries and reports. Sure, there have been failures, but allow me to skip a listing of both the successes and failures in the interest of time. But let me just make one point that I think is crucial, that during this period, Afghanistan has changed. We have seen the emergence of a whole new generation post-2001 that is changing the demography and face of Afghanistan, and who carry the promise of a modern democratic Afghanistan. None of this would have been possible without the support of the international community, including the US, the UN system, the European Union, the numerous international conferences of Afghanistan hosted by the UK, Japan, Turkey, and many other generous governments. Afghanistan's success is also very much their success. Its failures are also their failures. If the international community today abandons the democratization project to a cynical game of power sharing and patriarchy, where the power of the vote is reduced to nothing, in closed-door negotiations, whether in the Doha or Moscow formats. This is the constituency, actually their own constituency, the constituency that we ourselves have helped nurture, that we'll be betraying. We will in effect be betraying ourselves. Before I wrap up with a few comments on India's position on the Taliban, or maybe if we run out of time, we can tackle it in the question and answer, let me just address one last issue, which is perhaps the most obvious argument for talking to the Afghanistan, that they are a military and political reality, and that by various estimates, they occupy between 40 to 55% of Afghan territory, that they are a legitimate political force within Afghanistan, that they represent the Afghan people as much as others, and that their legitimacy is apparent from the parallel government that they run in parts of Afghanistan. This too is questionable. The Taliban claim to legitimacy is not based on any test of popular will. There is a fundamental contradiction between the idea of an Islamic emirate and that of an Islamic republic. Indeed, as believers in the Islamic emirate, the Taliban do not believe in the popular will reflected in the Islamic republic, though apologists claim that they have made such a shift. Their claim to legitimacy is based solely on the supposed control over Afghan territory. This, as we know, is through the use of force and terrorism against the people of Afghanistan and the international community, not the laws of war, and externally sponsored and supported. Accepting their legitimacy without such a test is tantamount to accepting and rewarding externally sponsored terrorism. Nor does control of territory necessarily translate into numbers or the support of the population. There has been a significant demographic shift in the last 18 years of Western-supported democracy and prosperity towards cities, youth, and democratic empowerment. The Afghanistan of today is not the same as Afghanistan of 1996, where the Taliban was seen as a stabilizing force and liberators from the intra-Mujahideen conflict. Today, they are seen as destabilizing and controlled by Pakistan, and their ideology is atavistic. There are enough surveys, most recently an extensive survey conducted by the Asia Foundation, that indicate that the Afghan people may suffer them, but they do not want the peace of the Taliban. They at best represent a current of political opinion in Afghanistan, not the dominant ideology. It is possible that they may share power for a while with the jihadi leaders as part of an interim arrangement, but this will be an uneasy compromise for both the jihadis and the puritanical Taliban. While the arrangement would be unstable and easy to fall apart, one also cannot rule out internal resistance to their rule. We cannot rule out that the Taliban could be a nationalist force and represent an Afghan voice, but that claim would be believable if they left their safe havens in Pakistan, cut off their covert support of the latter, and fought the battle by legitimate means from within Afghanistan. So far, they have not shown such independence. I think in the final analysis, the questions that we have to ask ourselves are the following. Is the choice being offered to the Afghan people through the peace process, ostensibly on their behalf, a choice between peace forced by terror imposed from outside, or a peace based on freedom from fear and respect for basic and fundamental freedoms and human rights, the same as people all over the world? A peace based on the logic of capitulation to terror, or a peace based on reconciliation? An inclusive peace, or a peace that excludes vast sections or even the majority of Afghans? A peace that is dignified and based on a balance of forces, or a peace that is in effect a surrender to terrorism in the name of peace? No less a person than the former US Ambassador Ryan Crocker has argued that this is in effect a surrender. By a perverse logic, those arguing for a dignified peace are now being portrayed as warmongers.
You've provided a very strong challenge to the current dominant narrative on the Afghanistan peace process, as well as a strong critique of the US-Taliban negotiations that are taking place, the peace process that you've described as a disengagement process. I'm sure there'll be several questions to you on these issues, particularly seeking your perspectives on different facets of this. But let me begin the discussion session by asking you a question on an issue that you haven't spoken about and which you mentioned at the end, and that is India's position towards the Taliban and the ongoing peace process. India has been consistently critical and opposed to the Taliban. A few weeks ago, for the first time, two Indian non-officials were sent to the meeting in Moscow, where they met the Taliban negotiators along with other countries. But that was the first time that India had been represented in those discussions and had met the Afghan Taliban. Where does the peace process today leave India, and what is India's policy and perspective towards some of the developments that could take place in the future?
Thank you.
Then I'll open it up to others.
Thank you, Rahul. India has been critical of the Taliban, but actually rather quietly, mainly because Afghanistan has been critical of the Taliban. Since London, India has accepted the formula of an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process, and in fact of late has added the word Afghan-controlled peace process. So I think would not be fair, and I don't think anybody is saying that India is opposed to peace talks. India is willing to go ahead with the peace talks provided they are Afghan-led and Afghan-controlled. But for peace talks to be successful, I think there are certain conditions that need to be met. One is that there needs to be some consensus within the Afghan establishment on what would be the terms, what would be the framework for negotiating such a negotiated end to the Afghan conflict. We believe that hasn't quite taken place. And therefore that any peace process that does not, in effect, put the horse before the cart is unlikely to yield any success. If we look back at President Trump's South Asia strategy, one of the very strong points that he made during that speech was that an exit from Afghanistan would not be time-based, it would be conditions-based. But once again, you are seeing exactly a repetition of what happened in President Obama's time, which is that, in fact, the peace talks or the disengagement process is being dictated by a timeline for withdrawal that is essentially decided in Washington, not in Afghanistan. Where does that leave India? You see, if you've heard me, it's very clear that we do not think that the Taliban are a dominant force. They are dominant only because of external support and the use of terrorism, and frankly, through the force of fear. We also don't feel that the post-2001 dispensation, the generation that has grown up and the generations that have separated it, those who have backed the Afghan constitution, are a pushover. Therefore, this whole expectation that somehow the peace talks will yield an end game to the Afghan conflict is to us unrealistic. If anything, it will only open a new chapter in the Afghan quagmire, and a new chapter in which the balance of forces is not, I don't think it can be presumed, is against the forces of democracy or the forces of a kind of moderation. Let's put it like this. So as far as India is concerned, this is a matter to be sorted out amongst the Afghans, and we would be able to go along with them. We are quite convinced that any negotiated deal that is reached on Afghanistan that is not entirely controlled by Pakistan will reserve a space for us in Afghanistan in the future. We are not unduly or unnecessarily perturbed by that. But I think the gains of the last 17 years, and this is something that even the leaders who participated in Moscow underlined, have the support of the Afghan people, and because of that should be preserved.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions, comments, discussions. Let me turn to David Loyne, formerly based in Kabul with the BBC. David.
Yeah, I'm at King's College now. I was formerly with the BBC in Kabul, and most recently as an advisor to Ashraf Ghani's office.
I remember actually meeting you
in Kabul. That's right.
Kabul, yes.
You paint a very compelling criticism of the American sort of decoupling, as it were, of security and the future of what's happening within Afghanistan. But I wonder if you could sketch out an alternative.
Yeah.
Because there is a more charitable
Yeah.
or a different analysis of the American peace plan is that all that Dalmai Khalilzad is doing is negotiating withdrawal against ceasefire with the Taliban, and then leaving it to the Afghan government, then bringing them to the negotiating table with the Afghan government. Once you have a ceasefire, then the talks, I think in his mind, will happen in Kabul. Is that not a sort of credible way of looking at the American peace plan, a slightly more charitable way of looking at the peace plan? And if that isn't going to work, then how could we bring the Taliban and the Afghan government together, given that we've been trying for a while?
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's a very fair question. And the answers are not easy. But let's start with some basics. The one is simply what I underlined just a minute ago, that it cannot be done under pressure of time. It cannot be done without a political consensus. So I would say that the first step that needs to be taken is to actually start a process that brings about a certain political consensus within the post-2001 order on what you can negotiate and what is not negotiable. Now, the process by which that takes place, that is open-ended. It's for the Afghan people to decide. It could be the High Peace Council, which is actually constituted precisely for such a purpose. It could be a loya jirga, though once again a loya jirga would not be a very transparent mechanism and would be dominated by jihadi leaders, or it could be the Afghan government itself. But I think the first step is that the people of Afghanistan and political forces of Afghanistan need to rally together with the Afghan government, which has offered unconditional peace talks with the Taliban, to actually know its own position on where to go with the peace process. Second, under no circumstances, at least at this point of time, should the government of Afghanistan, and this is regardless of the popularity or not of the current government, should be undermined. Because by undermining that government, you are in fact undermining the entire structure of post-2001 Afghanistan. So I think if we start off from these two positions, and the third, that it's premature of the US at this point of time for its own interests as well as the interests of Afghanistan to actually talk about a withdrawal process without coming to some agreement on a negotiated settlement. I mean, this is negotiations 1.0. You simply don't do that. And let me just very briefly spell out a kind of, the slippery slope that we can anticipate. When we talk about a drawdown, it's not clear the timetable, it's not clear the numbers. Let's say 50%. What will be the role of that 50% in Afghanistan? If they have no role to fight, then why are they there? And if they are not really going to be there to fight, then of course the question will be opened up is why should the Taliban accept American military support for the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces? In other words, let the Americans fight through the Afghans and not insist that that too should be stopped. And if that were to be stopped, then we would have a repeat of the post-Soviet withdrawal, the Najibullah period, in which case, you have anarchy at large. So I think these three conditions, a kind of national consensus, no timeline, and that the US backing for the Afghan government should not be withdrawn, at least until the Taliban have decided to make a break with external support from wherever it may be, from sanctuaries outside the country. Otherwise, in effect, what you have is that one side has external support, but the other side does not. I believe quite firmly that the Afghan people are quite capable of fighting their own battles, as they have done in the past. So I think this is the basic point that I would like to say on this.
Thank you.
Sorry, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Let me turn to my colleague Antoine Levesque, the Research Fellow for South Asia.
Ambassador, hello, nice to see you
Yes,
again.
good to see you again.
Antoine Levesque, a research fellow for South Asia here. I just want to ask you what the legacy of India could be in light of its investment of over $2 billion and with the prospect of withdrawal of a number of security guarantees which are provided by foreign forces.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, is that okay? Look, whatever India has done has been done and handed over to the Afghan government. It's for the Afghan government if they want to use the parliament or Salma Dam or the the transmission lines that have been set up or not, we are not actually running anything. Even the small development projects are actually budgeted through the Afghan government and implemented by the Afghan government. So it's really entirely up to them. And as far as we know, if the Taliban really claimed to have the support of the people and have their ears and feet on the ground, they would recognize the groundswell of support that is for India through its development activities and other forms of support. And they themselves would have to moderate their positions vis-a-vis India. The question is, once again, really what autonomy and independence do they have? And so far we have not seen concrete and material signs of that autonomy and independence. If they can resist Pakistani control over their decisions, I don't think there should be any problem for India to continue its relationship. And in any case, that relationship will continue. The Afghan people will continue to have their relationship with India unless and until the Afghan government, the Taliban government, decides to stop flights to India and stop the air cargo that comes to India and stop straight through Chabahar and stops everything that benefits the Afghan people themselves. I don't see that happening.
James, if you could identify yourself properly and designation.
James Chirian Gandhit, Institute of Commonwealth Studies and editor of Commonwealth and Comparative Politics. My question is related to to your response to David here, and that is, what do you see as the possible pressures on the Taliban that might incline them towards participating in as you described it, an Afghan-led and Afghan-controlled peace process? What do the external actors who support the Taliban and elements in the Taliban who may be inclined to engage in such a way, what do they need to do to push, given the fact that the Taliban have until now insisted on only participating in a foreign-led process?
Okay. Yes. Two answers to that. One is the short answer, simply external pressure on Pakistan. The kind of pressure that was shown by Richard Armitage when the US, President Bush, demanded Pakistani cooperation for the war against terror. Look, I'm going to be a little dramatic here, but in effect, the US has been fighting a war against Pakistan in Afghanistan. The Afghan people, whether it's the government or the security forces or the Taliban, are just all in effect, part of this war. So and this is something that President Obama, with his kind of intelligence, had diagnosed right in the beginning when he was actually campaigning for the US elections. At that point, he had said that the Iraq war was a war of choice, the Afghan war was a voice of necessity. Though the theater of the Afghan war was in Afghanistan, its locus was really in Pakistan, and that was the origin of the hyphenated AFPAC. So this is not that the Americans have not been aware of that. And they've been aware that US forces that have been losing their lives, 2,200 or 300 of them, have in fact been losing their lives supported from across the border. I think the question that we have to ask is why, despite successive phases of realization on the part of the West in general, but the United States in particular, that this war is actually emanating from Pakistan, they have not been able to act on it. That's a question that I think should be better put to the United States.
Let me turn now to Adil.
Thank you, Rahul. Adil Sultan from King's College. Ambassador, your statement, the last statement, that US has been fighting war against Pakistan in Afghanistan, I should take it as a compliment, because the rest of the international community was in Afghanistan and Pakistan has been able to defeat the rest of the international community in Afghanistan. I think that's a very irresponsible, with due apology, the statement is. Pakistan has suffered the most. You're talking about 2,000, 3,000 people. Pakistan has lost 70,000 people. So if you talk about Afghanistan once you say they are controlled by outside forces, I think you are disrespecting the Afghans also. Because these 50% Taliban, if you're saying, they are also Afghanis. And you claim to say they don't think for their own country and they are just acting on Pakistan's behalf. I think that's a disrespect for the Afghanis also, apart from the Pakistan. My question for you is, why India is so interested in Afghanistan? You don't have a border. You never hosted Afghan refugees. You just spent $2 billion. We can understand the pain that $2 billion is going down the drain, not producing any result. But why India is so concerned about Afghanistan? You do not share the border. The brunt of Afghan war for the last 40 years has been faced by Pakistan, not India. And I can go on commenting on Pulwama. I think we need to realize Pulwama is an indigenous sect. And I should stop there because
this is Afghanistan related. But Ambassador asking.
Ambassador linked Pulwama. So that's why I'm saying there's no
as one of the implications, consequences. Anyway, see, on this question about, the statement that I made, all right, in a talk like this, there is a space for rhetorical flourish. And even apart from the rhetorical flourish, the fact is that the Afghans themselves say that these elements are actually being supported from Pakistan. So it's not me, disrespecting the Afghans for this. This is something that is widely accepted in Afghanistan. On the question of Pakistan having suffered, no doubt it is true. But let us be very clear that this is Pakistan is suffering, but its suffering is its own creation. This is very different from what is the case for either India or for Afghanistan.
Let me turn now to, the gentleman in in front.
Siddiqui. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for a very comprehensive analysis. Two questions. One is in terms of when you say the Taliban may stop the trade from India. Probably it's such an uneconomic activity. The most expensive wheat to be traded into Afghanistan, probably any government who can get, better terms from anywhere else may go for it. So probably it may be more economic reasons if Taliban would have to do that because it's not sustainable. Yeah. It's supply which works out for a time being for a discussion like this. So I take your point. The question is, where do you think the India got wrong in terms of the Afghan strategy? Or where you think, what were the turning points where you realized that you are even, in a way putting Americans that they can't understand what they're doing. You are, looking at ISAF and say they have not done the job. Where does you think that India could not influence, and what are the factors which kind of, back to you, because you can't take away Pakistan and put that in New Zealand, because, Pakistan is there, they share border, they've got, even Iran share border, but Pakistan has really seriously helped US in their war on terror, so you can't take away that credit from Pakistan. But where do you think the Indian policy turned, basically, its eyes towards what it should achieve? And what is the Indian policy?
No, I don't think,
Thank you.
Frankly, I'm sort of intrigued that you say that Indian policy somehow had realized its mistakes and changed, because as far as I'm aware, the one thing that I can say about Indian policy is that it has been consistent. It is the one country that has not flipped and flopped on the Afghan issue. I mean, if you see the US policy and even the Western policy as a rule, they have been changing course from time to time under different considerations. And I don't think there is any aspect of the Indian-Afghan policy that we can say has failed, except for what you might mention, why did we not succeed in persuading or convincing the Americans about our position? Well, I mean, I can't really answer that because clearly India is only one factor in the US's overall calculations on Afghanistan. And the India factor was clearly not that important for Afghanistan, for US to change its policies for our sake. And I think the closest that we came to some kind of recognition of the role that India played was in Trump's South Asia strategy, though recognition of India's positive role had been there right from the time of Rumsfeld and and beyond. I've been privy to this discussion, so I can say that. Let me actually and on the question of wheat and economy, look, wheat is something that we are providing to Afghanistan as a food security. But much more important is the $750 million that Afghanistan is earning today on the exports of its agricultural products. And so I think, wheat may or may not be economical. In any case, that's a gift from India. So that's a different matter. But I actually missed out one question of the gentleman behind on the third row, which is what is India's interest? The fact is today, in today's world, every country has an interest in everybody else, and Afghanistan has been our historical neighbor well before Pakistan came into existence. Afghanistan has been a very critical part of India's history and its culture and its civilization. It's very difficult to tear Afghanistan apart from India or India apart from Afghanistan. And I'll say this because it's very important, because somehow post-Taliban or post the US Soviet intervention and post the US Soviet withdrawal, Pakistan has created a narrative that somehow they have an automatic and intrinsic relationship with Afghanistan through relationships of kinship and tribe and religion, and that somehow India has never had this relationship. That is extremely wrong. As late as the Dawood period, India used to have military contingents based in Kabul. Now, this may seem to some of you as fiction, but I traveled through Afghanistan as a student in 1977, and I myself have seen this with my own eyes. So it's very easy to forget history, and it's quite easy nowadays to falsify the narrative as well. This is a false narrative.
We're running out of time. I have 4 people on my list, so let me take the first 2 names. If they could ask questions or make comments simultaneously.
There was a lady
the
here.
lady in yellow, yes, please. And after that, Vipul.
Good afternoon. I'm a student from King's College, London. My question to you is, you were talking about the dilution of jihadist ideas that the US is basically focusing on, which is why they've initiated the whole democratic process. But say the whole democratic process in peace talks takes place and US finally withdraws. How exactly do you think will radicalization be stopped in that area? Because radicalization, as you see, like nowadays, is very easy. You can have you get it through different sources on the internet. You have Anwar al-Awlaki's ideas everywhere. So how exactly do you think the radicalization process will stop?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, do you think there will be a need of international intervention again in that area?
Yeah.
Vipul, yes.
I've got one brief comment and a question. In 21st century, a country doesn't have to be next door neighbor before it has got interest. Now, countries have got regional as well as global interest. So otherwise, the contradiction to that is a fallacy. India has provided substantial assistance to Afghanistan, probably up to $3,000 million, $3 billion. For ports, hospital, parliament building, so on and so forth. And now, to help landlocked Afghanistan, India is creating a passage through Iran's Chabahar port. What is the attitude of Taliban towards Indian investment?
Well, yeah. So let me take the first question. See, what I said about the dilution of somehow the US expectation that by making a concession to the Taliban, somehow the jihadi ideology will be diluted. I think that is misplaced. Second, I have had three snapshots, because I won't claim to be more than that, in Afghanistan. First in 1977 as a student, second in 2001 when we reopened the mission in Kabul, and the third from 2010 to 13 when I was there as ambassador. It might be a little, people may be a little skeptical about what I say, but honestly, I have not seen radicalism in Afghanistan. The radicalism in Afghanistan has come from outside. And there are enough forces and movements within Afghanistan today that would oppose, politically, firstly, oppose such radicalization. In fact, there was a very strong movement, to look at other countries in order to be able to limit and contain the kind of radicalization that was coming out of madrasas in Pakistan. And those are, those are serious cases. I mean, the whole case of suicide bombers. If actually anyone were to do an analysis of the number of suicide bombings that take place, and the kind of infrastructure of support that would be required for it, and the training ground and the sustenance and the logistics and so on for it, you would actually have a virtual jihadi industry operating in the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, but primarily, this is an export that has come from outside. It is not something that is truly indigenous. And on your question, which was about
what is the Taliban response to Indian investments?
Yeah. The interesting thing is that actually Taliban has issued very few statements against us. I remember that when we actually signed the strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan I think we were the first, by the way, we were well before the US. It was in 2011, perhaps. We picked up chatter, which you can easily do in those quarters, that elements in Pakistan, I should not name who, were trying to incite the Taliban against the strategic partnership agreement. Actually, the Taliban did not say anything. So I think the Taliban fully know that India works for Afghanistan's benefit. And, but it is not able to impose its will on Pakistan on this. That is our reading of that.
Thank you. The last two people on my list are Murtaza and Viraj. Murtaza, if you could identify yourself, please.
Hi, Ambassador Gordon. My name is Murtaza Ali Shah. I work for Pakistan's Geo Television.
Sorry, from? Geo. Geo TV, yeah.
I wanted to ask you, how do you see the Afghan peace process going? After what happened yesterday, India attacked Pakistan and then Pakistan today captured two Indian pilots. What are going to be its implications for Afghanistan, and also how do you see it playing out in India?
Viraj?
Yeah.
Hi, so Viraj Solanki, research analyst for South Asia at the IISS. How does India view China's role in a post-US Afghanistan following the declaration in the April 2018 Wuhan summit between India and China that the two countries would carry out a 2+1 framework within Afghanistan versus a current situation where the US-China strategic trust is fraying? Thank you.
On your question, I must say actually you're taking me into a highly speculative realm, and I'm not at all, I'm not at all comfortable with answering that question. All I can say is that I think, was it yesterday or day before, that Special Representative Khalilzad met Mullah Baradar and tweeted about that meeting. It seems as though the US is going to pursue its talks regardless, one way or the other. But I would be very skeptical if it did not have any impact at all. But how exactly is rather difficult for me to speculate at this point of time. I mean, one is certainly there will be dynamics within Afghanistan that will be affected by this. There will be dynamics involving Pakistan and Afghanistan and Pakistan and India that will be affected by this. We heard a statement by the Pakistani ambassador that, that if India were to do anything to Pakistan, then they would actually take it out on Afghanistan. In other words, a bilateral problem being exported to a third country. I mean, that is simply inadmissible. But I'm not sure that they intend to follow that up, so I would not like to speculate on that. But you've had some stray straws in the wind on that. On your question on the China thing, I think China is a very interesting thing. Actually, there has of late already been a kind of track 2 kind of dialogue between India and China to see what China and India can actually do together in Afghanistan. And that track 2 dialogue actually has been quite constructive. And one of the things that we have seen is that following India, now China has an air corridor with Afghanistan on Afghanistan's pine nuts, which are a very high value product for Afghanistan. So I think there is but I don't think this kind of cooperation is really going to go into strategic areas, the sort that you're talking about, which have a kind of impact or affected by the US-China talks. But it is quite possible that the tensions or frictions between the US and China have made China a little more amenable to talking to us about global issues and regional issues. So that is possible. But certainly, as of now, there is a track 2 dialogue and it's proceeding satisfactorily. Thank you.
Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, thank you for this. We have run out of time, so we will end the session now. But before we end, I'd like to thank you for coming here and providing, I think, a very useful, thought-provoking perspective on the way that you see developments currently taking place and emerging in Afghanistan. But also, as was very clear from the discussion, a strong challenge that you provided to the current narrative on the peace process. So for those two reasons, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your perspectives here, and I'd like all of you to join me in thanking Ambassador.
Thank you, Rahul, and thank you all. Pleasure to have spoken to you.